What if I told you that a captive teenager in ancient Babylon saw your future? That over 2,500 years ago, a prophet decoded dreams that revealed every major empire that would rise and fall until the end of the world. Daniel didn't just predict the future, he gave us the timeline. He saw kingdoms that didn't even exist yet. He prophesied the exact year the Messiah would appear. He described the final world leader who would defy God himself. Scholars call him the prophet of the apocalypse. His visions terrified him so much that he became physically ill. Angels appeared to him, calling him highly esteemed by heaven. Kings trembled at his words. His prophecies are so eerily accurate that skeptics refuse to believe he wrote them before the events happened. But here's what makes Daniel truly extraordinary. He was given visions about the time of the end, and biblical scholars believe we're living in that time right now. The beasts he saw rising from the sea, the little horn that speaks blasphemies, the abomination of desolation, the resurrection of the dead. Daniel saw it all, and he saw it for us. This isn't just ancient history. This is a message sealed for the end times, and the seal is being broken. Are you ready to discover what Daniel knew? Are you ready to see what he saw? Welcome to the story of the man who looked into eternity and lived to tell about it. The book of Daniel opens with a moment that changed everything. As we read in chapter 1, verse 1, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." Picture this scene in your mind. The most powerful army in the world surrounds the holy city. The Babylonians have conquered nation after nation, and now they've come for Jerusalem. This wasn't just another battle. This was the city of God, the city where Solomon's temple stood, the city where God's name dwelled. And now Babylonian soldiers surrounded its walls, their siege engines ready, their army stretching as far as the eye could see. The people inside must have been terrified. Verse 2 tells us what happened next. "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God." Notice something crucial here. The Bible doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar won because he was stronger. It says the Lord gave Judah into his hand. This was God's judgment on his people for their unfaithfulness. But the defeat went deeper than just losing a battle. The sacred vessels from Solomon's temple were taken. These were the golden lampstands that had burned for hundreds of years, the altar implements that priests had used in daily worship, the bowls and cups that had been part of temple ceremonies since Solomon's time. These weren't just valuable objects, they represented God's presence with his people. And where did they end up? In the temple of a false god in Babylon. This was a statement. It was as if the Babylonians were saying that their gods had defeated the God of Israel. For the people watching this happen, it must have felt like the end of the world. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want treasure. He wanted people. Specifically, he wanted the best and brightest young men from the nations he conquered. Verse 3 describes his strategy. "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility." This was deliberate and calculated. Nebuchadnezzar didn't want random captives. He wanted young men from the top families in Judah, the royal family, the nobility, the sons of the people who had been running the country. These were young men who had been raised with education, privilege, and expectations of leadership. Verse 4 gets even more specific. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Look at that list. No physical defects. They had to be healthy and strong, handsome. They had to look the part, showing aptitude for learning. They had to be smart, well-informed. They needed good education already. Quick to understand, they needed to learn fast. Qualified to serve in the palace, they needed social skills to function at high levels of government. He wanted perfection, the absolute best that Judah had to offer, and he wanted them young, old enough to have received good education in their homeland, but young enough that their identities weren't completely formed yet. The verse continues, he was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. This reveals the plan. These young men weren't going to be slaves doing hard labor. They were going to be educated in Babylonian culture and then placed in positions serving the king. Why would a conquering king do this? Because Nebuchadnezzar understood that if he could take the best young minds and turn them into loyal Babylonian officials, they would be far more useful than slaves. They could help him rule. They could serve as examples to their own people that resistance was futile. So Ashpenaz had his orders. Out of thousands of captives brought to Babylon from Judah, he was to find the ones who met these high standards. Among all those young captives, 4 stood out. Verse 6 introduces them. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Just 4 names, simple and direct. But these 4 names would become legendary. Their story would be told for thousands of years. We don't know much about their backgrounds. The Bible doesn't tell us about their families in detail. We don't know their exact ages, though they were clearly young, probably in their mid to late teens. We don't know if they were friends before captivity or met in Babylon. The scripture doesn't give us those details. But here's what we do know. They were from Judah. They had been raised in the ways of the Lord. They knew the law of Moses. They had worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem. They had been taught about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They knew the stories of how God delivered their ancestors from Egypt. They understood what it meant to be part of God's chosen people. And now all of that was gone. Their homes were hundreds of miles away. Their families were either dead, scattered, or still back in Judah under Babylonian rule. The temple where they had worshipped was empty. Everything familiar was gone. They were teenagers in a foreign land, surrounded by strangers who spoke a different language, in a city filled with temples to false gods. Among people with completely different values and beliefs, they were outnumbered. They had no rights, no freedom. They were alone. Think about what that must have felt like, being ripped away from everything you know at that age. No family to turn to, no familiar places, no community of faith, no friends who understand what you believe, just you and a few others like you, trying to survive in a world that wants to change who you are. They had every reason to give up, every reason to be angry at God, every reason to decide that their faith didn't matter anymore. Every reason to just go along with whatever the Babylonians wanted. But something in these 4 young men was different. The Bible just gives us their names: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. 4 young men standing at a crossroads. 4 young men who had to decide who they really were. The Babylonians had a detailed plan for these young men. It wasn't thrown together. This was a systematic program designed to transform Hebrew boys into Babylonian men. Verse 4 had told us the king wanted them taught the language and literature of the Babylonians. But verse 5 adds crucial details. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. 3 years. That's how long the program would last. 3 years of intensive training, 3 years of being surrounded by everything Babylonian. The language, the writing system, the literature, the customs, the beliefs, everything. From morning until night, every single day. This wasn't just education, this was transformation. The goal was clear: take these Hebrew boys and turn them into Babylonian men, make them forget where they came from, replace their identity as children of Abraham with a new identity as servants of Nebuchadnezzar. They would study the Chaldean language, the language of the educated class in Babylon. It was complex and sophisticated, completely different from Hebrew. They would have to master it not just to survive, but to excel at the highest levels of government. They would read Babylonian literature. This included epic poems about Babylonian gods and heroes, stories about how their deities created the world, myths about divine battles, religious texts that presented a completely different worldview from what they had been raised with, historical accounts that glorified Babylon, wisdom literature that taught Babylonian values. They would learn Babylonian science and mathematics. The Babylonians were advanced in astronomy, keeping detailed records of stars and planets. They had sophisticated mathematical systems. They studied the natural world through their own cultural lens. They would be taught how the Babylonian Empire worked, the political structures, the social hierarchies, how to navigate court politics, how to be useful to the empire, how to serve the king effectively. Day after day, for 3 solid years, they would be immersed in this world. No breaks to go home, no visits back to Judah, no time off to be with other Hebrews and remember their own culture. Total immersion, constant pressure, relentless conditioning. The pressure to conform would be enormous. Everyone around them would be Babylonian. Everyone would worship Babylonian gods. Everyone would think Babylonian thoughts. To stand out, to be different, that would require incredible strength, but the Babylonians went even further. They went after something more fundamental. Verse 7 records what might seem small, but was actually a massive assault on identity. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. In the ancient world, names carried enormous weight. Your name wasn't just a label. It was a statement about who you were, where you came from, and who your God was. Names had meanings. They told stories. Let's look at what these young men were losing. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. Every time someone called him Daniel, it was a reminder that there was a God in heaven who judged with righteousness. It was a statement that ultimate authority didn't belong to earthly kings, but to the God of heaven. Hananiah's name meant the Lord is gracious. It was a testimony to God's character, to his kindness and mercy. Every time you said Hananiah, you were making a statement about who God is. Mishael's name meant who is like God. It was a rhetorical question with an obvious answer. No one. No king, no empire, no false god could compare to the true God of Israel. The name itself was an act of worship. Azariah's name meant the Lord has helped. It was a testimony to God's faithfulness throughout Israel's history, a reminder that God had always been there for his people. These weren't just nice-sounding names. These were theological statements. These were declarations of faith. These were connections to heritage, to people, to God. Every time someone said their names, it was a reminder of who they really were. Now those names were being taken away. Daniel became Belteshazzar, which meant something like Bel, protect his life. Bel was one of the chief gods of Babylon. So Daniel's new name was literally a prayer to a false god. Every time someone called him Belteshazzar, it was an acknowledgement of Babylonian religion. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah became Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, names connected to Babylonian deities and culture. They were names that fit in Babylon, names that didn't make uncomfortable statements about the God of Israel. This was psychological warfare. Every time they heard their new names, and they would hear them constantly, they were supposed to be reminded that they belonged to Babylon now, that their old identity was gone. The Babylonians were trying to rename not just their persons, but their very souls. So along with the education and name changes came another element that seemed like a privilege, but created a serious problem. Daily provisions from the king's own table. Verse 5 had mentioned this. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. This was royal food, the finest cuisine in the entire empire. The best meats, the richest dishes, the finest wines. Most people would have been thrilled. Most captives would have considered this amazing luck. Here they were, prisoners from a conquered nation, and they were being fed like royalty. They were eating the same food served to the king himself. But for Daniel and his friends, this created a crisis of conscience. The food from the king's table wasn't just any food. Much of the meat would have been from animals that the law of Moses specifically said the Israelites shouldn't eat. Pork was common in Babylonian cuisine, shellfish, various animals that weren't killed according to proper method. Even worse, in Babylonian culture, food served from the king's table had often been dedicated to idols first. It was part of their religious practice to offer food to their gods before eating. The wine was used in pagan ceremonies, so eating this food wasn't just about dietary laws. It meant participating, even indirectly, in the worship of false gods. For these young men, this wasn't about being difficult. This wasn't about personal preferences. This was about the law of God. This was about commands given to Moses on Mount Sinai. This was about staying faithful to what they had been taught since childhood. The law included detailed instructions about what Israelites could and couldn't eat. But these laws weren't arbitrary. They were meant to set God's people apart, to make them different, to remind them constantly that they belonged to God. Every meal was supposed to be a reminder of their unique identity, but refusing the king's food was dangerous. It could be seen as insulting the king. After all, the king had been generous. To reject it might be interpreted as rebellion, and rebellion could cost you your life. Nebuchadnezzar was known for harsh punishments. Everything else had been taken from them. Their country, their freedom, their families, even their names. But this, what they put in their mouths, this was something they could still control. This was a choice they could still make. This was where they could still be faithful. This was the line in the sand. Here's where we see Daniel's wisdom shine through. He had a decision to make, and how he handled it reveals something important about his character. Verse 8 tells us, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." Notice the first part. Daniel resolved. He made up his mind. He decided. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment reaction. This was a settled decision. He had thought about it, prayed about it, and determined what he was going to do. The word resolved suggests firmness and conviction, but notice what he did next. He didn't stage a protest. He didn't make a scene. He didn't stand up and announce he was too righteous for the king's food. He simply, quietly, respectfully approached the person in charge. He asked the chief official for permission. Think about that. He asked, he requested. He didn't demand his rights. He didn't threaten. He asked for permission. This was incredibly wise. He understood he was a captive in a foreign land. He understood these people had all the power. He was firm in conviction, but respectful in approach. Verses 9 and 10 show what happened. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." First, notice God was at work. God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. This wasn't just luck. God was preparing the way, softening hearts, creating opportunities. This is how God works, often quietly in ways we don't see at the time. But even though the official liked Daniel, he had a problem. He was scared, and his fear was reasonable. He explained, "I am afraid of my lord the king." He had been given orders directly from Nebuchadnezzar. If he disobeyed, there would be consequences. The king would then have my head because of you. This wasn't a figure of speech. The official was literally saying that if Daniel and his friends looked unhealthy, the king would execute him. So the official liked Daniel but valued his own life more, which is understandable. So Daniel tried a different approach. He went to someone lower in the chain of command. Verses 11 and 12 tell us, Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink." The guard was directly responsible for their daily care. And Daniel made him a proposal. Notice the word please. Notice he called himself and his friends your servants. He was being humble and respectful. And what did he propose? Test your servants for 10 days. Just 10 days. Not forever, not even for the full 3 years. Just 10 days of eating vegetables and drinking water. Just 10 days to see what would happen. Verse 13 continues, "Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." He was saying, look, I understand your concern. So let's do an experiment. Give us 10 days. Then judge for yourself based on what you see. If we look worse, we'll eat the royal food. But if we look fine, let us continue. This was brilliant. He wasn't demanding or arguing theology the guard wouldn't understand. He was being practical and reasonable. He was suggesting a test with observable results. He was giving the guard an easy out. The guard didn't have to understand Hebrew dietary laws. He just had to look at them after 10 days and compare. Daniel was putting the decision in the guard's hands based on results, not religious arguments. He was showing flexibility in methods while remaining firm in conviction. This showed that faithfulness to God doesn't require being confrontational. Verse 14 gives the result. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. The guard said yes. The test was on. 10 days passed. Every day, Daniel and his 3 friends ate their simple meals of vegetables and water. Meanwhile, all the other young men continued eating the rich food from the king's table, the finest meats, the richest dishes, the best wine. And every day the guard watched. At the end of 10 days, the moment of truth arrived. The guard looked at Daniel and his friends. He compared them to the others, and what he saw must have shocked him. Verse 15 describes it. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Read that carefully. They didn't just look okay. They looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. Not some, not most. All of them. This made no sense by normal standards. They had eaten only vegetables and drunk only water. The others had eaten rich meats and fine foods and drunk wine. By every reasonable expectation, Daniel and his friends should have looked worse. But they looked better, healthier, stronger. This was obviously God's doing. God was honoring their faithfulness. God was showing that obedience to Him leads to blessing, even when it doesn't make logical sense. Verse 16 tells us, "So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead." The test worked. They were allowed to continue. Their faithfulness was honored, but the story doesn't end there. God's blessing went far beyond just physical health. Verses 17 through 20 describe something extraordinary. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. God gave. This wasn't just natural intelligence. This was a supernatural gift. God gave them knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. Everything they were being taught, they mastered. They excelled, and Daniel received something extra. He could understand visions and dreams. This gift would become crucial to his entire story. After 3 years, they were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. The king personally questioned them, tested their knowledge, evaluated their abilities. And his verdict was clear. He found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Out of all the young men in the program, these 4 stood out. But verse 20 makes it even more dramatic. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom, 10 times better. Not just a little better, 10 times better than all the professional wise men who had spent their entire lives studying Babylonian wisdom. These 4 young men, who had been in Babylon only 3 years, who had started as captives, were 10 times better than all the experts. The king was so impressed, he immediately gave them positions of influence. They had started as prisoners, but they had refused to compromise. They had stayed faithful in what seemed like a small thing, their diet. And God honored their faithfulness with supernatural wisdom and success. Verse 21 adds one final detail. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel would serve through multiple kings, through the entire span of the Babylonian Empire. His faithfulness in this first test was just the beginning. Time had passed since Daniel and his friends had entered the king's service. Now in the second year of his reign, something happened that would change everything. Chapter 2, verse 1 tells us, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. Picture the most powerful man in the world, lying awake in his bed. This was the king who had conquered nations, the man who commanded the greatest army on earth, the ruler of an empire that stretched farther than anyone could travel in months. And yet he couldn't sleep. A dream had come to him and it had shaken him to his core. This wasn't just any dream. Something about it felt different. Something about it felt important. It wasn't like the normal confusion of dreams that fade away in the morning light. This dream had weight. It had power. It carried a sense of significance that the king couldn't shake off. But here's the problem. When Nebuchadnezzar woke up, the details began to slip away. Have you ever had a dream that felt incredibly important, but when you woke up, you couldn't quite remember it? That's what happened to the king. The images faded. The details became fuzzy. The memory eludes him like trying to grab smoke with your hands, yet the feeling remained. The sense that he had witnessed something significant, something that mattered deeply, wouldn't leave him. It haunted him. It kept him awake. It filled him with anxiety and desperation. He knew he had seen something important, but he couldn't remember what it was. And this drove him nearly mad with frustration. The king wasn't the type of man to sit around feeling helpless. He was used to getting what he wanted. He was used to having problems solved. So he did what any Babylonian king would do. He called for his wise men. Verse 2 describes this. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. These were the professionals, the experts, the people who were paid to interpret dreams and predict the future. In Babylonian culture, dreams were taken very seriously. They were believed to be messages from the gods, and these wise men were supposed to be the ones who could decode those messages. But then Nebuchadnezzar made an unprecedented demand. Verse 3 continues, Then the astrologers answered the king, May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. This was the normal way things worked. You tell them your dream, and they tell you what it means. Simple, but the king had a different idea. Verse 4 records his response. The king replied to the astrologers, This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. Let that sink in. The king wasn't just asking them to interpret a dream, he would tell them. He was demanding they tell him what the dream was first and then interpret it. He wanted them to read his mind, to know what he had dreamed without him telling them. Why would he do this? Maybe he suspected his wise men were frauds who just made up interpretations. Maybe he wanted to test them to see if they really had supernatural powers. Maybe he thought that if they couldn't tell him the dream, they couldn't be trusted to interpret it correctly. Whatever his reason, he had made up his mind. Verse 5 makes it even clearer. The king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is only one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. The wise men were terrified. Verses 10 and 11 record their response. The astrologers answered the king, "There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." They were basically saying, what you're asking is impossible. No human being can do this. Only the gods could tell you what you dreamed, and the gods don't talk to us like that. It was an honest answer, a reasonable answer, but it was the wrong answer to give this king. Nebuchadnezzar didn't respond well to being told something was impossible. Verse 12 tells us, "This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon." Think about that for a moment. All the wise men, not just the ones who had failed to answer his question, not just the magicians and enchanters who were standing in front of him, all of them, every wise man in the entire kingdom of Babylon. It was a sweeping, brutal death sentence issued in a moment of rage. Verse 13 continues, "So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death." Here's where it gets personal for Daniel. He and his 3 friends were counted among the wise men of Babylon. They had entered the king's service. They were part of that group. And yet they hadn't even been brought before the king. They hadn't been given a chance to try. They hadn't been consulted at all. But it didn't matter. The death decree included them anyway. Imagine Daniel going about his day, doing his work, serving faithfully as he always did. And then suddenly, armed men show up to arrest him and his friends, not because they had done anything wrong, not because they had failed at anything, but because the king had made a blanket decree and they happened to fall under it. The executioner's name was Arioch. He was the commander of the king's guard, and his job was to carry out the death sentence. Verse 14 tells us, "When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact." Notice that phrase, wisdom and tact. Daniel didn't panic. He didn't argue. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't try to run. Instead, he spoke to Arioch with wisdom and tact. Even in a life or death situation, Daniel kept his head. Verse 15 continues, "He asked the king's officer, 'Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?' Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. Daniel asked questions. He wanted to understand what was happening. Why was the king so angry? What had led to this death sentence? And Arioch, perhaps because he respected Daniel, or perhaps because he saw no harm in explaining to a man about to die, told him the whole story. He explained about the dream, about the king's impossible demand, about the wise men's failure to answer, and that's when Daniel made a remarkably bold move. Verse 16 tells us, "At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time, so that he might interpret the dream for him." Read that again. Daniel went into the king who had just ordered all the wise men executed, the king who was furious and unpredictable, the king who had absolute power of life and death, and Daniel, a young man from a conquered nation, a captive who had been in Babylon just a few years, walked right in and asked for time. This took incredible courage. Remember, the other wise men had just failed spectacularly. They had told the king his request was impossible, and the king's response had been to order them all killed. Now Daniel was going to that same king and saying, "Give me time, and I'll do what they couldn't do. I'll tell you your dream and interpret it." Why would the king listen to him? Why would the king give him a chance when he had just condemned all the other wise men? We're not told exactly. Maybe Daniel's reputation for wisdom had already reached the king's ears. Maybe God gave Daniel favor in that moment. Maybe the king figured he had nothing to lose by waiting a little longer. Whatever the reason, the king said yes. He gave Daniel time. The execution was postponed, and Daniel left the king's presence with a massive problem to solve. He had bought time, But now he had to deliver on his promise. He had to do what no one else in Babylon could do. He had to tell the king his dream. Daniel didn't go off by himself to try to figure this out. He didn't rely on his own intelligence or wisdom. He knew exactly where to turn. Verse 17 tells us, "Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah." These were the same three friends who had stood with him years earlier when they refused to eat the king's food. The same three who had been faithful to God alongside him. The same three who were now facing execution along with him. Daniel went straight to them. Verse 18 tells us what he said to them. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Notice what Daniel did. He called a prayer meeting. He gathered his closest friends, the people who believed the same things he did, and he said, "We need to pray. We need to ask God for help. We need to plead for mercy." Daniel understood something crucial. He understood that this wasn't a problem he could solve with human wisdom. No amount of cleverness or education or intelligence was going to tell him what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed. This required divine intervention. This required God to reveal something that no human could know. And notice what was at stake. Verse 18 mentions it clearly, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Their lives were on the line. If God didn't reveal this mystery, they would die. Not just Daniel, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah too. And not just them, but all the other wise men in Babylon as well. But there was something else at stake too, something even bigger. This was an opportunity to demonstrate God's supremacy. All the magicians and enchanters and astrologers had failed. They had admitted that only the gods could reveal such things. Now, if the God of Israel revealed this mystery through Daniel, it would be a powerful witness to Nebuchadnezzar and everyone in Babylon. It would show that the God of heaven was real and powerful in a way that Babylonian gods were not. So the four young men prayed. They pleaded for mercy. They asked God to reveal the mystery, and then they waited to see what God would do. They didn't have to wait long. Verse 19 tells us, "During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision." During the night, while Daniel was sleeping or perhaps in a trance-like state, God showed him what he needed to know. God revealed the mystery. God showed Daniel exactly what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed, not just the interpretation, but the dream itself. Every detail, every image, everything. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Going to sleep with your life hanging in the balance, not knowing if you'll live to see another day. And then God gives you the answer. God shows you exactly what you need to know. The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming sense of God's faithfulness. Daniel's immediate response wasn't to run to the king. It wasn't to celebrate with his friends. His first response was worship. Verse 19 continues, "Then Daniel praised the God of heaven." Before he did anything else, Daniel stopped to thank God. He stopped to praise God. He stopped to acknowledge that this answer came from God, not from his own abilities. Verses 20 through 23 record Daniel's prayer of praise. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Listen to what Daniel says about God. God has wisdom and power. God controls history. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up new ones. God is the source of all wisdom and knowledge. God reveals mysteries. God knows everything, even things hidden in darkness. And God answers prayer. This wasn't just a generic thank you. This was Daniel declaring who God really is. This was Daniel acknowledging God's character and God's sovereignty. This was Daniel making sure everyone knew, including himself, that what was about to happen was God's doing, not his own. Now Daniel was ready to go to the king. But first he had something important to do. Verse 24 tells us, "Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, 'Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him.'" Notice what Daniel said first. Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Daniel wasn't just trying to save his own life and the lives of his 3 friends. He was trying to save all the wise men, even though those other wise men worshiped false gods, even though they had failed where Daniel was about to succeed. Daniel didn't want them to die. He showed compassion even to people who weren't like him. Verse 25 continues, "Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, 'I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means.'" Arioch was apparently eager to bring good news to the king. He rushed Daniel into the king's presence. And notice how he described Daniel, a man among the exiles from Judah. Daniel was still known as a captive, a foreigner, someone from a conquered nation. But now this captive was about to do what no Babylonian wise man could do. Verse 26 records the king's response. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" The king was skeptical. Can you blame him? All his most experienced advisors had failed. They had told him it was impossible. And now this young man from Judah was claiming he could do it. The king wanted to know, are you really able to do this? And here's where Daniel made something absolutely clear. Verses 27 and 28 record his answer. Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that passed through your mind as you were lying in bed are these." Daniel started by agreeing with the other wise men. They were right. No human being can do this. No wise man, no enchanter, no magician, no diviner. None of them have the power to read someone's mind and tell them what they dreamed. That's beyond human ability. But then Daniel pointed to a different source. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Not the gods of Babylon, not the gods who don't live among humans, but the God of heaven, the true God, the God who does reveal things to his people. And notice what Daniel didn't say. He didn't say, "I can tell you your dream." He didn't take credit. He didn't make it about himself. He made it clear from the beginning that if he was about to tell the king his dream, it was because God had revealed it to him. This was going to be God's moment to shine, not Daniel's. Verse 29 continues, "As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen." Daniel was explaining that the dream came to Nebuchadnezzar because he was thinking about the future. And God, who reveals mysteries, chose to show him what was going to happen. This dream wasn't random. It was a message from God about the future of the world. And then, in verse 30, Daniel made absolutely sure the king understood where this information was coming from. "As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone living, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind." Daniel was saying, "I'm not smarter than everyone else. I'm not more gifted than everyone else. God revealed this to me for one reason, so you, King Nebuchadnezzar, would know the interpretation. This is for you. This is God speaking to you." Daniel completely removed himself from the equation. He was just the messenger. God was the one with the message. Now came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Would Daniel really be able to tell the king what he had dreamed? Verse 31 begins the description. "Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance." Can you imagine the king's reaction? As soon as Daniel said, "a large statue," the king must have felt a jolt of recognition. Yes, that's what I saw. A statue. Daniel was describing exactly what Nebuchadnezzar had dreamed. Verse 32 continues with more details. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. Daniel described it piece by piece, starting from the top. The head was pure gold, gleaming and brilliant. The chest and arms were silver. The belly and thighs were bronze. The legs were iron, and the feet were a mixture, partly iron and partly clay. This was a statue made of different metals, getting progressively less valuable as you moved down from head to feet, but getting progressively stronger too, until you reached the feet, which were weak because they were mixed with clay. The king was listening intently. This was exactly what he had seen. Every detail matched, but the dream wasn't finished yet. Verse 34 describes what happened next. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. A rock appeared. But this wasn't a normal rock. It was cut out, but not by human hands. This was a supernatural rock. It came from God. And this rock struck the statue right at its weakest point, the feet made of iron and clay. Verse 35 tells us what happened when the rock hit the statue. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. The entire statue was destroyed. Not just the feet, everything. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold. All of it shattered into pieces so small they were like chaff, like the light husks that blow away when grain is threshed. And they disappeared completely. The wind swept them away. No trace left, but the rock didn't disappear. Instead, it grew. It became a huge mountain. And that mountain filled the whole earth. It didn't just occupy one place. It expanded until it covered everything. Nebuchadnezzar was listening in astonishment. This was exactly what he had dreamed. Every single detail. The statue with its different metals. The mysterious rock. The destruction of the statue. The rock becoming a mountain. All of it, word for word, image for image. Daniel had done the impossible. He had told the king his dream. Verse 36 records Daniel's next words. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Daniel had passed the first test. He had proven that God had truly revealed the mystery to him by describing the dream perfectly. Now came the second part, the interpretation. What did this dream mean? What was God trying to tell the king? But that explanation would have to wait. For now, the king knew one thing for certain. The God of Daniel was real, and he truly did reveal mysteries. Time had passed since Daniel interpreted the king's dream. Nebuchadnezzar had seen himself represented as the head of gold in that great statue. Perhaps that image stayed with him. Perhaps it planted an idea in his mind. Or perhaps he had other reasons. Whatever motivated him, the king decided to build something that would be remembered forever. Chapter 3. Verse 1 tells us, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. This wasn't a small statue. 60 cubits high, that's about 90 feet tall, as high as a 9-story building. 6 cubits wide, about 9 feet across. This was an enormous golden image that could be seen from far away. It dominated the landscape. You couldn't miss it. The king had it set up on the plain of Dura. This was a flat open area in the province of Babylon where large crowds could gather. The location was deliberate. This image was meant to be seen by thousands of people. It was meant to make a statement. We're not told exactly what the image looked like. Was it a statue of a god? Was it a representation of the king himself? Was it some kind of symbol of the empire? The Bible doesn't say. What matters is that Nebuchadnezzar had it built, and he expected everyone to treat it with the highest reverence. Some people think the king was inspired by his dream, the dream where he was the head of gold. Maybe he liked that idea so much that he decided to make an entire statue of gold. Maybe he wanted to extend his reign, to make his kingdom last forever, unlike what the dream had prophesied. Or maybe this was about unity. Nebuchadnezzar ruled over many different peoples with many different religions. Perhaps he thought that if everyone bowed to the same image, it would create unity in his empire. Whatever his reasons, the king had created a monument to power, and he was about to demand that everyone acknowledge that power in a very specific way. The king didn't just build the image and leave it standing there. He planned an elaborate ceremony for its dedication. This was going to be a major event. Verse 2 tells us, he then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. Look at that list. Satraps were the governors of large regions. Prefects were military commanders. Governors managed cities and districts. Advisors counseled the king. Treasurers managed finances. Judges handled legal matters. Magistrates enforced laws. And all the other provincial officials, everyone who had any position of authority or importance in the empire. This wasn't optional. This was a command from the king. Everyone who was anyone in the Babylonian Empire had to attend this ceremony. Verse 3 continues, so the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before it. Can you picture this scene? Thousands of officials from all over the empire gathered on the plain of Dura, standing before this massive golden image. The sun reflecting off the gold, making it shine brilliantly. The crowd stretching as far as you could see. The sense of power and pageantry. Then something happened that changed everything. Verses 4 and 5 tell us, then the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. A herald, an official announcer, shouted out the king's command, and he made sure everyone understood. This command was for everyone, every nation, every people, every language, no exceptions. When you hear the music, and he listed all the instruments, horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must do something specific. You must fall down. You must worship the image. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't an invitation. This was a command. And verse 6 makes clear what would happen if you didn't obey. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. The penalty was death. Not prison, not a fine, not exile, death. And not just any death, being thrown into a blazing furnace, one of the most horrible ways to die imaginable. Burned alive, and notice the word immediately. There would be no trial. No chance to explain yourself, no appeal. If you didn't bow down when the music played, you would be thrown into the fire right away. The king had made his demand crystal clear. The consequences were laid out for everyone to hear. Now all that remained was to see who would obey and who would refuse. Verse 7 tells us what happened next. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The music played, and everyone bowed. All the nations, all the peoples, every language. Thousands of people falling down on their faces before the golden image. Everyone obeyed the king's command. Everyone except 3 men, but some people noticed. Verse 8 says, at this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. These were Babylonian officials, likely some of the same magicians and astrologers who had failed to interpret the king's dream years earlier. They had seen Daniel and his friends promoted to high positions. They had seen these foreigners given authority and honor, and they didn't like it. This was their chance to get rid of them. Verses 9 and 10 record what they said. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." They started by reminding the king of his own decree. They repeated it word for word. They wanted to make sure the king remembered exactly what he had commanded and what the penalty was. They were building their case. Then came the accusation. Verse 12, "But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Notice how they worded this. They didn't call them by their Hebrew names. They used the Babylonian names the king had given them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They reminded the king that he had given these men positions of authority. "You have set them over the affairs of the province of Babylon." And then they made it personal. These men pay no attention to you. They're not just breaking a rule. They're disrespecting you personally. They neither serve your gods, they reject your religion, nor worship the image of gold you have set up. They reject your authority. This was a calculated accusation designed to make the king angry. And you'll notice something interesting. They only mentioned 3 names. Where was Daniel? The Bible doesn't tell us. Maybe he was away on official business. Maybe he was sick. Maybe for some reason he wasn't at the ceremony. We don't know. But his 3 friends were there, and they had refused to bow down. The accusers had seen them standing while everyone else was on their faces. They had watched these 3 Hebrew men remain upright, while thousands around them bowed down. And now they were reporting it to the king, hoping for the king's fury to fall on these foreigners. The accusation had its intended effect. Verse 13 tells us, "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." So these men were brought before the king. The king was furious. These were men he had personally promoted, men who owed their positions to him, men who should have been grateful and loyal. And they had defied his direct command in front of thousands of witnesses. But interestingly, the king didn't immediately throw them into the furnace. He gave them a chance. Verse 14 records what he said. "And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?'" He asked them directly, "Is this true? Did you really refuse to bow down?" He wanted to hear it from them. Maybe he hoped the accusers had been wrong. Maybe he hoped there was some explanation. Or maybe he just wanted to give them one more chance to submit. Verse 15 continues, "Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The king laid it out clearly. Here's your second chance. When the music plays again, if you bow down, everything will be fine. All will be forgiven. You can keep your positions. You can keep your lives. Just do what everyone else did. But if you refuse again, you will be thrown into the furnace immediately. No more chances. No delays. And then the king added something revealing. "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" This was no longer just about enforcing a decree. This was personal. This was the king's pride speaking. He was essentially saying, "You think your God can save you from me? I'm the most powerful man in the world. I command armies. I rule an empire. What God can stand against my power?" This was a direct challenge, not just to the 3 men, but to their God. Nebuchadnezzar was throwing down the gauntlet. He was saying, "Let's see if your God is real. Let's see if he can save you from my furnace." The king had turned this into a contest between himself and the God of Israel. The 3 men didn't need time to think about their answer. They didn't ask for a moment to discuss it privately. They didn't try to negotiate or find a compromise. Their response was immediate and clear. Verse 16 begins, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." That's a remarkable way to start. They weren't going to make excuses. They weren't going to explain or justify their actions. They weren't going to defend themselves. What they were about to say would speak for itself. Verses 17 and 18 continue, "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Let's break down what they said, because this is one of the most powerful statements of faith in the entire Bible. First, they affirmed their faith in God's power. The God we serve is able to deliver us from it. They had no doubt that God could save them. God had the power to protect them from the fire. God could deliver them from the king's hand. They believed this completely. Second, they expressed confidence that God would deliver them, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. They trusted that God would act on their behalf. But then, and this is crucial, they added something that shows the depth of their faith. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up, even if God doesn't save us, even if we die in that furnace, even if the outcome isn't what we hope for. Even then, we will not bow down. We will not serve your gods. We will not worship your image." This is faith that doesn't depend on getting what you want. This is faith that says, "I'll trust God even if he doesn't do what I think he should do." This is faith that obeys regardless of the consequences. They weren't bargaining with God. They weren't saying, "God, if you save us, we'll serve you." They were saying, "We'll serve God no matter what happens to us. Whether we live or die, we belong to him." And notice they made this statement directly to the king. "We want you to know, your majesty." They looked the most powerful man in the world in the eye and told him calmly, clearly, and with complete conviction, "We will not bow to your image. Our loyalty to God is not negotiable. You can kill us, but you cannot make us worship false gods." The king's reaction was immediate and extreme. Verse 19 tells us, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. The king was beyond angry. He was furious. His face changed. Literally, the text says, the appearance of his face changed toward them. His expression twisted with rage. How dare these men defy him? How dare they choose their God over his command? And he didn't just order them thrown into the furnace. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. 7 times. This was overkill. The furnace was already hot enough to kill someone. But that wasn't enough for Nebuchadnezzar. His pride had been wounded. His authority had been challenged. He wanted these men to suffer. He wanted their death to be a spectacle. He wanted to make an example of them so terrifying that no one would ever dare disobey him again. Verse 20 continues, "And commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. He called for the strongest soldiers. Not just any guards, but the most powerful men in his army. Why? Maybe because he thought these 3 men might resist. Or maybe because the heat would be so intense that only the strongest men could get close enough to throw them in. Either way, he was taking no chances. Verse 21 adds a detail that seems small but becomes significant. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. They were bound up, tied with ropes so they couldn't escape, and they were thrown in fully clothed. The king didn't even give them time to remove their outer garments. He wanted them dead immediately. The robes, the trousers, the turbans, the other clothes, everything went into the fire with them. Then comes verse 22, which describes something unexpected. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The furnace was so incredibly hot that the soldiers who threw the 3 men in were killed by the flames. Just getting close enough to throw them in was fatal. The heat was so intense that these strong soldiers, these men chosen specifically because they could handle difficult tasks, died instantly from the heat. Think about that. The furnace was hot enough to kill someone just from being near it. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been thrown into the middle of it. Verse 23 confirms, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. They fell into the fire. Tied up, unable to move, wearing all their clothes, they dropped into the flames. By all human logic, by everything anyone knew about fire and heat and human bodies, they should have been dead in seconds. Their bodies should have been consumed immediately. This should have been the end of their story, but it wasn't. Something happened that no one expected, something that defied all logic and reason. Verse 24 tells us, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? The king suddenly jumped up. He had been watching, probably from a safe distance, and he saw something that made him leap to his feet in shock and amazement. He turned to his advisors and asked them a question that should have had an obvious answer. Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? Of course there were 3 men. Everyone had just watched it happen. Why would the king ask such a strange question? Verse 24 continues, they replied, certainly, your majesty. The advisors confirmed it. Yes, 3 men. We all saw it. We all watched them get thrown in. What's the problem? And then the king said something that changed everything. Verse 25 records his words. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. 4 men, not 3, 4, and they were walking around, not lying still, not being consumed by flames, walking, moving, alive, and they were unbound. The ropes that had tied them up were gone. They were free and they were unharmed. The fire that had killed the soldiers who threw them in, the fire that was 7 times hotter than usual, wasn't hurting them at all. But the most shocking part was the 4th man. Where had he come from? 3 men had been thrown into the furnace. Now there were 4. Who was this 4th person? The king said he looked like a son of the gods. In Nebuchadnezzar's pagan understanding, this was the only way he could describe what he was seeing. This 4th figure didn't look like a normal human. There was something divine about him, something supernatural, something that spoke of the presence of deity. Who was this 4th man? The Bible doesn't tell us explicitly here, but most people believe this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, what theologians call a Christophany. This was God himself, in visible form, walking in the fire with his faithful servants. When they were thrown into the furnace, they weren't alone. God was with them. The God that Nebuchadnezzar had challenged, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand, had answered that challenge. Not by preventing the 3 men from being thrown into the fire, not by putting out the flames, but by entering the fire with them, by being present with them in their suffering, by protecting them in the midst of the flames. Nebuchadnezzar's response to what he saw was immediate. Verse 26 tells us, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. The king who had just condemned them to death was now calling them to come out. And notice what he called them, servants of the Most High God, not rebels, not traitors, not criminals. Servants of the Most High God. He acknowledged that they served a God higher than him. A God who was, in fact, the Most High. The king approached the opening of the furnace, probably as close as he could get without being burned himself, and shouted for them to come out. This was an order, but not an angry one. This was shock. This was awe. This was a man who had just witnessed something that shattered his entire understanding of reality. Verse 26 continues, So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. They walked out, calmly, in their own time. They came out of the blazing furnace that had been heated 7 times hotter than usual, the furnace that had killed the soldiers who threw them in. They walked out alive, and what did people see when they emerged? Verse 27 describes it, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. All the high officials who had gathered for the dedication ceremony crowded around to see. And what they saw was impossible. The fire had not harmed their bodies at all. Not burned skin, not blistered flesh, nothing. Not a hair of their heads was singed. Think about that. Hair burns easily. It catches fire quickly. But not one hair on their heads had been burned. Every hair was intact. Their robes were not scorched. Remember, they had been thrown in fully clothed. Those robes should have been burned off their bodies immediately. But the robes looked like they had never been near fire, and there was no smell of fire on them. When you're around fire, even if you don't get burned, you smell like smoke afterward. Your clothes absorb the smell, but these three men didn't even smell like they had been near fire, much less inside a furnace. The only thing the fire had destroyed was the ropes that bound them. They had gone in tied up and come out free. The fire had released them from their bonds, but touched nothing else. This was a complete, total, undeniable miracle. And everyone saw it. This wasn't something that happened in private that only a few people witnessed. All the important officials from across the empire were there. They all saw these three men thrown into the fire. They all saw them walk out unharmed. There was no way to deny what had happened. Verse 28 records Nebuchadnezzar's response. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." The king praised God, the same king who had built the golden image and demanded everyone worship it. The same king who had asked, "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Now he was praising the God of Israel. He acknowledged that God had sent his angel, his way of describing the fourth man in the fire, and rescued his servants. And the king acknowledged something else. These men had trusted in God. They had defied the king's command because of that trust. They had been willing to die rather than worship any other god. And their God had proven worthy of that trust. Verse 29 continues, "Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." The king issued a new decree. Anyone who spoke against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be severely punished. Why? Because no other God can save in this way. Nebuchadnezzar had witnessed something that proved beyond doubt that this God was real and powerful in a way that no other God was. And then, verse 30 tells us the final outcome. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. They didn't just get their lives back. They didn't just get their positions back. They were promoted. They received even higher positions than before. The men who had been condemned to death for refusing to bow were now honored for their faithfulness. They had stood firm. They had refused to compromise. They had been willing to die for their faith. And God had vindicated them in the most public, most dramatic way possible. Years had passed since the fiery furnace. Daniel had grown older and kings had come and gone. Now a new king named Belshazzar sat on Babylon's throne. And in the first year of his reign, something happened to Daniel that would change everything. God was about to show him the future in a way he had never experienced before. Chapter 7, verse 1 tells us, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. This was different from before. Daniel wasn't interpreting someone else's dream anymore. God was giving him his own visions, and what he saw was so important that he immediately wrote it down. He didn't want to forget a single detail. Verse 2 describes how it began. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, And there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Picture this. Daniel saw the great sea being stirred up by winds, coming from all four directions. The water was turbulent, violent, churning. This wasn't a calm scene. This was chaos. Verse 3 continues, "Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea." Four beasts. Not normal animals. These were creatures unlike anything in the natural world. Each one was different, and they came up from the churning sea. Verse 4 describes the first beast. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. A lion with eagle's wings. The lion was the king of beasts. The eagle was the king of birds. But then its wings were torn off. It was made to stand on 2 feet like a person, and it was given a human mind. Verse 5 describes the second beast. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." The bear raised up on one side, and in its mouth were 3 ribs, as if it had already devoured 3 victims. Then it was commanded to eat more flesh. Verse 6 describes the third beast. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings, like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. A leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. This beast was given authority to rule, and its rule would be swift. Then came the 4th beast. Verse 7 describes it. After that, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. This beast was so terrifying, Daniel couldn't even compare it to a known animal. It had iron teeth, and it crushed everything. And it had 10 horns. Verse 8 continues, "While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. A little horn appeared and uprooted 3 of the other horns. And this horn had human eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully." Suddenly, the vision shifted. Daniel wasn't looking at beasts anymore. He was seeing something that took place in heaven itself. Verse 9 describes what he saw. "As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. Thrones were set up." This was a courtroom scene, a place of judgment. "And the Ancient of Days took his seat." This was God himself. His clothing was pure white. His hair was white like wool. His throne was on fire, burning with holy judgment. Verse 10 continues, "A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. Fire flowed out from God's throne, and surrounding him were countless attendants. The court was in session. The books were opened." This was Judgment Day. Verse 11 tells us what happened to the 4th beast. "Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire." The little horn kept speaking boastfully. But then judgment came. The 4th beast was killed and thrown into fire. Verse 12 adds, "The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. The other 3 beasts lost their power, but continued to exist for a while." Then Daniel saw something amazing. Verses 13 and 14 describe it. "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. one like a son of man. This figure looked human, but came with the clouds of heaven. He approached God and was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations would worship him. His kingdom would last forever. Time passed, and Daniel received another vision. Chapter 8, verse 1 tells us, "In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me." This was the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign. God was giving Daniel another vision with more specific details about the future. Verse 2 describes where Daniel was. "In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal." Daniel wasn't physically in Susa, but in the vision he saw himself there, standing beside the Ulai Canal. Verse 3 describes what Daniel saw. "I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later, a ram with 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer and had grown up later." Verse 4 continues, "I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. This ram was powerful. It charged in 3 directions and conquered everywhere. No animal could stand against it." Then something new appeared. Verse 5 tells us, "As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground." A goat appeared from the west. This goat was incredibly fast. It crossed the earth without touching the ground, and it had a prominent horn between its eyes. Verse 6 describes what happened. "It came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage." The goat charged at the ram with great rage. Verse 7 continues, "I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat completely destroyed the ram. It shattered both horns. The ram that had been so powerful was now powerless." Verse 8 tells us what happened next. "The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. The goat became very great, but at the peak of its power, the large horn was broken off, and 4 prominent horns grew in its place." But the vision wasn't finished. Verse 9 describes something else. "Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. Out of one of the 4 horns came another horn. This one started small, but grew toward the south, the east, and toward the beautiful land, Israel." Verse 10 continues, "It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. This horn grew so great, it reached toward heaven. It threw down some of the starry host and trampled on them." Verse 11 makes this clearer. "It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. This horn exalted itself to be equal with God. It took away the daily sacrifice offered to God, and it threw down God's sanctuary." Verse 12 continues, "Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Because of rebellion, God's people were given over to this horn. The daily sacrifice stopped. The horn prospered. Truth was thrown to the ground." Then verse 13 tells us, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, 'How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people.'" Daniel heard angels talking. One asked, "How long will this last?" Verse 14 gives the answer. "He said to me, 'It will take 300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. The answer was specific, 2 to 300 evenings and mornings. After this time, the sanctuary would be cleansed and restored. Daniel was trying to understand what he had seen. Verse 15 tells us, "While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man." Someone appeared who looked like a man. This was an angel. Verse 16 continues, "And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, 'Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision.' A voice called out, commanding the angel, 'Gabriel, explain this vision to Daniel.'" This is the first time Gabriel is named in the Bible. Verse 17 describes what happened. "As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. 'Son of man,' he said to me, 'understand that the vision concerns the time of the end.'" Gabriel approached, and Daniel was terrified. He fell face down. Gabriel told him this vision concerns the time of the end. Verse 18 continues, "While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. Daniel fell into a deep sleep, but Gabriel touched him and raised him up." Verses 19 and 20 record Gabriel's explanation. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia." Gabriel explained the ram. The two horns were Media and Persia, joined together as one empire. Verse 21 continues, "The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king." The goat was Greece, and the large horn was the first king, Alexander the Great, who would conquer Persia with incredible speed. Verse 22 adds, "The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power." When Alexander died, four kingdoms would emerge from his empire, divided among his generals, but none would have Alexander's power. Verses 23 through 25 describe the little horn. "In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. This fierce king would arise when wickedness reached its peak. He would be cunning. He would become very strong through another power. He would cause terrible devastation. He would destroy God's people. He would prosper through lies. He would exalt himself even against God, but he would be destroyed, not by human power, but by God." Time passed, and Daniel was studying Scripture. Chapter 9, verse 2 tells us, "In the first year of his reign, Daniel understood from the Scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Daniel was reading Jeremiah's prophecy about 70 years of desolation. That time was almost up. So Daniel prayed. His prayer in verses 3 through 19 was a confession of sin. He acknowledged that Israel had rebelled against God, had not obeyed his laws. He pleaded for God to restore Jerusalem and his sanctuary. While Daniel was praying, verse 21 tells us, "While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice." Gabriel appeared again, flying swiftly to Daniel at the time of the evening sacrifice. Verse 22 continues, "He instructed me and said to me, 'Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding.'" Gabriel came to give Daniel insight. Verse 23 records, "As soon as you began to pray, a word went out, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision." As soon as Daniel started praying, God sent the answer. Gabriel told Daniel he was highly esteemed by God. Verse 24 states, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. 77s, 70 weeks of years, or 490 years, were decreed for Israel and Jerusalem. During this time, 6 things would be accomplished. Transgression would finish, sin would end, wickedness would be atoned for, everlasting righteousness would come, vision and prophecy would be sealed, and the most holy place would be anointed. Verses 25 and 26 provide detail. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. From the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah comes would be 69 sevens, 483 years. After this, the Anointed One would be cut off, put to death. A coming ruler's people would destroy the city and sanctuary. Verse 27 adds, "He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him." 1 final 7 remained. A ruler would make a covenant but break it halfway through, stopping sacrifices and setting up an abomination in the temple. More years passed. Babylon had fallen and Persia ruled. Chapter 10 verse 1 tells us, "In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who was called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. Daniel was now an old man. He had served through multiple kings. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, he received a final detailed revelation. Verses 2 and 3 describe what Daniel was doing. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks were over. Daniel had been fasting for 3 full weeks, praying and seeking God. Verses 4 through 6 describe what happened. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches, his arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze, and his voice like the sound of a multitude. Daniel saw a glorious being by the Tigris River. He was dressed in linen with a gold belt. His body looked like topaz. His face was bright like lightning. His eyes blazed like torches. His arms and legs gleamed like bronze. His voice sounded like a great crowd. Verse 7 tells us, I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. Those who were with me did not see it, but such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. Others were with Daniel but didn't see the vision, yet they felt terror and ran away. Verse 8 describes Daniel's reaction. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. The vision drained Daniel completely. His face turned pale. He felt helpless. The being spoke to Daniel, explaining that his prayers had been heard from the first day. The being had been sent to answer but was delayed by spiritual opposition. This revealed spiritual warfare happening in heavenly realms. The being delivered detailed prophecies about conflicts between kingdoms. Chapter 11 describes wars, alliances, and persecutions in remarkable detail. Verse 36 describes a coming ruler. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place. This king would exalt himself above every god, even speaking against the true God. The final vision reaches its climax in chapter 12. Verse 1 begins, "At that time Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered." Michael would stand up for Daniel's people. There would be a time of distress unlike anything in history. But God's people, those whose names were written in the book, would be delivered. Verse 2 states, "Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. The dead would rise. Some would awake to everlasting life, others would awake to shame and contempt." This was a clear prophecy of resurrection. Verse 3 adds, "Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." The wise would shine brightly forever. Those who led others to righteousness would shine like stars. Verse 4 gives Daniel a command. "But you, Daniel, roll up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge." Daniel was told to preserve this prophecy until the time of the end. Daniel asked in verse 6, "How long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled?" He wanted to know when this would happen. Verse 7 gives an answer. "The man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, 'It will be for a time, times, and half a time.' When the power of the holy people has been finally broken, all these things will be completed." The answer was a time, times, and half a time, likely 3.5 years. Daniel didn't understand, so he asked again in verse 8, "I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, 'My Lord, what will the outcome of all this be?' Verse 9 answered. He replied, 'Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end.' Daniel was told not to worry. The words were sealed until the end times. Verses 10 through 12 continue. "Many will be purified, made spotless and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,135 days. The righteous would be purified. The wicked would remain wicked." Specific time periods were given, 1,290 days and 1,135 days. Finally, verse 13 gives Daniel a personal promise. "As for you, go your way till the end. You will rest, and then at the end of the days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance." Daniel was told to go on with his life. He would rest, he would die, but at the end of days he would rise. He would be resurrected and receive his inheritance for a lifetime of faithfulness. If this story has impacted you, if Daniel's faith has challenged you, if these prophecies about the end times have opened your eyes to what's coming, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Click that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories that reveal God's power and faithfulness throughout history. And leave a comment telling us what spoke to you most about Daniel's life. The end times are approaching. The prophecies are being fulfilled. The question is, will you be ready? Will you stand firm like Daniel? Will you shine like the stars forever and ever? The choice is yours. But Daniel's story shows us that faithfulness is always worth it, because God always keeps his promises.